Hello, welcome to this pre-funding webinar that will assist local education agencies in New Hampshire to prepare competitive grant applications to the New Hampshire Department of Education. An overview of today's session is that participants will understand the funding opportunity announcement, also called the FOA, throughout this presentation, how to demonstrate your need with data, how to create grant-aligned goals, select evidence-based practices to support your application, outline your budget and timeline for implementation and evaluation, and we will end with tips for success. First and foremost, it's always important to read the funding opportunity announcement all the way through. The FOA contains important information that will help you be successful in your application. There will be a designated period during which the LEA can email any questions or concerns to the Department of Education and receive a response. Make sure you email any questions that you have within this window to receive a response within that time. Determine how your project idea or ideas align with the goals of the funding opportunity. This is really important to make sure that your intended project matches what the funds are intended for. Be sure to take note of requirements and formatting for submitting your application. Are there particular page limits, fonts that need to be used, attachments, signatures, etc.? Failure to take note of these requirements may result in an incomplete application, which would result in you not being considered for the funding. And be sure to mark the application deadline on your calendar so that you don't miss the due date. How to demonstrate your need or needs with data for the funding opportunity announcement. All grants have an intended purpose to address a need or gap. And it's important to demonstrate how your local education agency intends to use funding to fill this need or gap. Provide relevant data to demonstrate these needs of the population that you plan to serve with grant funds. You can use a variety of data sources to illustrate the need, including any listed in the funding opportunity announcement. This is a great place to find a starting place to start to look for relevant data that could support your application. Be sure the needs that you're describing will be addressed by your proposed project. This is an important tip. Sometimes we see data that isn't necessarily connected to what the project would actually do. So make sure that those two are connected, that the need described with data will also then be addressed by the activities and the components of your project that you select. Once you've done that, you'll want to create some grant-aligned goals. So when possible, use language from the funding opportunity announcement to develop your goals. This will show that you've understood what the grant's intended purpose is and that your activities will meet the goals of the funders. Goals should be within the scope of the funding opportunity. It's important not to go too far outside the bounds of what was articulated in that funding opportunity announcement. They should be aligned with the funding agency's objectives. They should be achievable within the timeline of the grant. It's important to stay, again, within the boundaries of what's possible within the performance period. And it is also important for the funder to see that your project will be able to be sustained past the life of the grant. Finally, you want to make sure that your grant-aligned goals are measurable. Can you demonstrate to the funder that you will be able to demonstrate progress and success with your application and your selected activities? Now I will pass it to my colleague.
Another part of your application might include selecting an evidence-based practice with which the funds will be used for. In general, funders like to support programs that have proven outcomes. Evidence-based means that there has been some educational research conducted to suggest that this strategy or program is effective. The strength of the evidence is determined by the following criteria: the number of relevant studies, the type of study design, was it randomized control trial, quasi-experimental, as well as the sample size and the context of the population studied, and then the strength of the findings. What were the results or outcomes of this conducted research? So take this all into consideration when you're selecting your practice and reviewing the research that was conducted. If you're using a practice that does not have an evidence base, be sure in your response that you provide a clear explanation as to why this practice would be best, and why the funds match, why the purpose of these funds match this evidence base, and then what research does exist to support that it'll work with your school population students. And then finally, just as a tip, there are existing clearinghouses out there that provide a repository of evidence-based practices. Feel free to do a quick search yourself, but there are a few like What Works Clearinghouse, which is sponsored by the US Department of Education, Blueprints program, and there's also the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, just to name a few. So when you're selecting a practice, there are a few things that you might want to consider. And the first is program or practice considerations. So what is the practice? What is the evidence associated with its outcomes that it's promoting? Is it usable? Could we, as staff, pick up and use this program with relative ease? And are there supports built in? So are there people we can ask when we run into questions, or are there resources available to us to implement this with fidelity? And then you also want to consider your local context. This is typically your school or your district. Does that program meet our local need? Does it fit within our local context? And do we as adults have the capacity to implement this program well? So these are just a few things to consider as you are reviewing and selecting an evidence-based practice for your funding opportunity. Next, you'll want to take a look at budget, timeline, and evaluation. So you'll want to make sure that the budget you propose, the timeline you propose, and any evaluation efforts fit within the goal of the grant, but also the timeline of the grant. You want to ensure that you can complete all of your activities within whatever the proposed timeline is. You also want to ensure that you can demonstrate that you've reached your goals. This is often called an evaluation. If you're setting a goal to improve some student outcome, you want to have data to ensure that you can prove this happened. And to do that, you'll often write an evaluation plan. So you'll articulate how you know this project was successful, who will be impacted by this project, and then what data will you collect to measure the success? And you'll want to include details like how often this data is collected, just to give a sense of the scope of work being done. We're going to wrap up this webinar with some tips for success. So as you're applying, we encourage you to get it done early. We all know that technology is great until it doesn't work. So try to avoid some of those pitfalls. There are hard deadlines for the funding opportunities. So be sure to have that, like Catherine said, saved on your calendar and get your application done early. Be sure to read the FAQs. We'll post those after the window for asking questions. So any question that was asked to the department will then get posted with a response. And then you'll also want to be sure that within your proposal, you can accomplish all of the required activities within that grant window. And you want to articulate how you'll do that in your application. Also account for the time for like administrative approval for your school board to accept the grant and those types of things that could potentially eat into your performance period. And that's it for our webinar to support your application process. We hope you have a great day and best of luck.